Good morning, everyone. This is Heather Smith of the Michigan Concrete Association, and we would like you to welcome you to our winter webinar series. Today, we will be talking about silica and silica in construction, the current state emphasis program. We have Keith Langworthy here. He is a senior industrial hygienist, consultation for the Consultation, Education, and Training Division of MIOSHA. So his job is to help you be able to do this stuff better and know what to do. And today we're going to talk about your silica programs and what to be prepared for in the event of an inspection, and hopefully answer any questions that you might have regarding this. So Keith, if I missed anything, let me know. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or the question and answer, and we will get to those at the end. And with that, I would like to introduce Keith Langworthy. And Keith, you can take it away.
Thank you, Heather. I appreciate that. Thanks to everyone who showed up for this presentation as a rescheduled event from a massive power outage in Portage. I'm glad to see everyone came along. I am here to share with you a presentation from our Consultation, Education, and Training Division. In my background as a senior industrial hygienist for MIOSHA's Construction, Safety, and Health Division, I worked with MIOSHA for 22 plus years, covering the west side of the state, and a lot of different concrete construction companies I have seen. It's the first time I've talked to you guys, so I'm happy to be here, and I want to go through a few things related to silica and, more importantly, the current state emphasis program. Basically, a state emphasis program for OSHA or MIOSHA here in Michigan is something that we've been instructed to conduct additional inspections on. And really the basis of the state emphasis program is Part 690, which is the silica in construction standard. And it covers all construction employers who deal with silica in a major way. And of course, you guys do. What do employers who are have employees who are exposed to crystalline silica, what do they have to do? Number one, and this is, I'm glad it's on the first slide, it's very important. A lot of times we will go into great detail to say what a state emphasis program is. Suffice it to be said, the MIOSHA enforcement officers that I work with, of which I used to be one, are instructed to go conduct more, a lot of things through the Dodge reports and through reports from our counterpart safety officers, do more inspections. And this is the second year for MIOSHA's Silica in Construction State Emphasis Program. But in order to be the employer who's ready for that, these are the things you need to do just to get your people ready. I assume that many of the companies here, since you care enough to try to understand these things, a lot of the companies will already have put programs together. Number one is to establish and implement a written exposure control plan. We have a sample exposure control plan, and if you want me to send you a copy of the sample exposure control plan, it's very easy. The easy part is for you to open the plan and for you to fill your name in where it says add your name here. But really, the hard part comes when you put together the things that your company does that fits into this program and that fit into this table one. And those are really important things for employers to know, because you can, by putting together the program, not only make yourselves more expert at it, but you can also have a way to train the employees on what they're supposed to do. And the reality is, the most important thing is to make sure that those plans, after they're put in place, actually function in the field. It's the difference between a blueprint and a product are taking it from the paper into reality. And for us, if you have this program, if you're following what the program says, you are effectively taking the standard into reality. That's the best thing we could expect you to do. In order to do that, you need to designate a competent person to implement the written exposure control plan. And of course, someone who's on site as well to uh, make sure your control plan is being put in place. The plan also says, all employers have to restrict housekeeping practices that expose workers to silica. Pretty simply put, in your business, a lot of that time it will look like somebody using a air hose to dust off their work clothes, or a leaf blower to blow off concrete surface. Those are housekeeping operations that can create exposures to not only your employer or employee, but other employees of other employers who are at the site. You have to offer medical exams when your person is exposed to silica in a significant way. That includes chest x-rays, lung function tests. These have to be offered every 3 years for workers who are required by the standard to wear a respirator. And the only way really for you to know whether that employee is required to wear a respirator is to look through the standard and the written exposure control plan and to determine that. Employers also have to train workers on work operations resulting in silica exposure and the ways to limit that exposure. Employers also have to keep records of the exposure and that employees face and the medical exams that they take. Sorry, I have an issue here. Apparently, my slide. Hang on. Well, there are a lot more. Hang on for just one moment. I'm sorry for this temporary delay. It appears that. Hang on. Tab.
For those of you that are online right now, while we're taking this little break here, write down Keith's email address and phone number here. After this presentation, if you have any questions, I'm sure he would be more than happy to answer them or help you through any of these inspections or details or things that you need to work out.
Sorry, what I'm trying to do is get back to a different presentation view from my PowerPoint. So please give me just a moment.
Just hit escape, Keith. If you
Okay.
the escape button, it'll take you.
All right. All right. I'm going to share from this perspective because I think it'll allow me to select into the previous hidden slides. Okay. So reshare. Am I sharing now?
You are sharing, but I can stop, you can stop sharing right now and then reshare your here.
It appears that they're all set to not show up. I have them all hidden.
Oh, you have them all hidden. I see what you're saying. Okay. Stop.
In order to save us some time, I'm going to share in this form.
That's fine. You'll have to stop sharing what you're currently sharing now, though.
Okay. Stop
So
sharing.
there you go. Now reshare your other page.
Share screen. And that would be
There you go.
Okay, great. Sorry for that inconvenience. I always have said MIOSHA is a technically inept, in some ways,
And if you
unit
would,
of government, but we do have a lot of great skills, and a lot of people do these presentations very well. I can tell you, it's not a simplest thing to present a presentation from someone else's office. I'm helping out someone here in uh, uh, Southwest Michigan, a different company, and sharing from that office. So thanks to them for that. But anyway, what's important is to know what a competent person is. A competent person, when you put this written exposure control plan together, is very important to designate that to a person. And for the control plan, you should have a person who's responsible for the plan. And on the site, there should be a competent person who fits this definition, who can put your plan in place for the crew that you have working there. A competent person is just like in any of the standards, individual capable of identifying and foreseeing respirable crystalline silica hazard in the workplace, and who has authorization to take prompt corrective measures, be knowledgeable, and have the ability to fulfill the responsibilities of the program. And most important, of course, is capable of identifying workplace hazards. If you see conditions where dust is present and silica exposures are occurring, the competent person then makes sure that work is falling within the company's silica exposure control plan. The silica exposure limits, and back in the days before 2015, 2016, when we got our new silica standard, these permissible exposure limits meant a lot less. They mean a lot more now, because with this new action level, which is 25 micrograms per cubic meter, employers can have a job that they do that doesn't fit into any of the tables. And if they do it well enough and keep the employees free of exposure and can measure that, they can basically do the work without protective equipment. So you do the testing and figure it out and find it below the action level, and you don't have to worry about it except for periodic reviews when you do this. The permissible exposure limit is 50 micrograms per cubic meter. It's pretty easy to get to if everything's not being followed well. But these written exposure control plans, when people put them together, the plans are great. A lot of times when I see them, as a MIOSHA industrial hygienist, I used to request these programs from employers, and they would provide me the written program, and I look at it, and it's great. Put together by the office, everybody puts these through a fine-tooth comb, but then you will get a situation like I saw in one of my last inspections on the enforcement side, which was in a school, and this employer had a great silica exposure control plan, and the exposure control plan said, after we do one pass with our buffing pad, we vacuum it up with a HEPA vacuum. But the fact is, this employer's employees had omitted the HEPA vacuum for a number of passes, and the employees ended up with these relatively large debris piles and concentric circles just in the area. Very evident, and they were all, this was a respirable crystalline silica exposure to the employees. But this is where silica exposures are common in your industry. I'm sure you guys are really familiar with construction, stone and concrete product, mining. It's also present in transportation, of course, when the roads are built and when parking garages are built. There's a lot of concrete and flat work. There's a lot of cutting, abrading. Once you get the stuff in the ground or in the forms, there's a lot of work that still has to be done to it. And that is where you guys come into play. There's always going to be a situation where you have to work on the concrete and disrupt, grind it off, abrade it off, cut it off, drill through it. Those things are things you need to put in your exposure control plan as the predictable work that you do. We're going to go in a few minutes to cover the table one. Table one in the standard gives you a lot of different things that are covered very specifically in the standard, and you can do these things and expect to get a predictable result. But there are going to be a lot of things that you guys do in your business that you may not be able to fit into the exposure control plan. Put those jobs together, describe what you're going to do, and this exposure control plan then puts you through exposure evaluation where you can expect to get a good result and not exposure people. And here we go with the silica health impacts. Silicosis, also known as grinder's disease, it can cause fibrotic changes in both lungs. And in your business, I would not be surprised that some of you may know former workers or colleagues who gotten sick of, or even worse, died from silicosis. For me, it's relatively common to get calls, even when I was in the enforcement side, from employees who've gotten silicosis. That's an awful thing because it usually happens to a person in their late 50s or 60s or 70s if they make it that long. And that person has worked a long life and has a lifetime's worth of experience, and sometimes great houses, jobs, cars, great family. But the disease that have progressed in their lungs for all of those years is stopping them from enjoying the latter part of their lives. Nobody wants that. If you guys are looking for a good motivator to protect your employees from crystal and silica, that's the first place to go. Of course, one of the other health impacts from silica is lung cancer. Silica is a confirmed human carcinogen, and that I can tell you there is nothing that I know of that's worse than seeing a person with lung cancer in about, I think it was 1977 or 78. It was 13 years old or 12 years old, somewhere in there. My grandfather was diagnosed and ended up having lung cancer. And for a period of time, he came back home, back home and back home. And in the end, he was just a shell of his former self. And when they rolled him over, his back looked like it was covered with leather. It was an awful thing. Here I want to cover something briefly in this brief video. So we'll take just a moment to cover that. Hang on.
Keith, make sure you hit share audio when you do that video.
Okay. Control, click, hit my audio.
You might have to stop share and reshare.
I'm sorry.
You're going to have to stop sharing and
Okay.
reshare. And at the bottom of the share button, click the thing that says share audio from my computer.
Okay. Good. Okay.
So stop sharing.
Stop share.
Hit share again.
Share screen.
And in the bottom of that share screen, there's a little button that says I'll use audio from my computer.
Share sound.
Yep, check that. And then share, and then we'll be able to hear what you have to say.
Okay.
report available to the working people of the United States and to their employers. This report shows how silicosis occurs, where it occurs, and what the disease is. The report emphasizes that these control measures, if conscientiously adopted and applied, that silicosis can be prevented.
When I first seen Francis Perkins' video, I was just outraged that in 1938, 60 experts spent just a year to figure it out. And to really make it simple, turn the water on or turn the vac on. My dad was a sandblaster for several years in his late 20s. Shortly after that, he became short of breath. We didn't know what it was. He had a couple collapsed lungs, and then finally the diagnosis came, it was silicosis. It took about 5 years to kill him, and we got to watch. The toughest thing was watching him come home when he couldn't work no more, and literally fell on the ground and cried. He said, "I can't do it no more." So the impact is huge. You know, anyone that's ever lost anyone knows exactly what I'm talking about, whether it's cancer or a sudden fall. But watching a loved one suffer is a real human toll. They didn't know then, and most people don't know now about the hazards of working around silica, dry grinding and cutting and polishing material that produces silica dust. The modern workforce can work safer. The silica standard can save lives. It will save lives. And frankly, it's going to save a lot of money. If over 50,000 people are dying every year from diseases they contract at work, some of them silica, imagine the cost. It's time to get the word out and let them know about this.
Great. Thanks for that. Back to what I believe is the PowerPoint presentation. Are we back to the PowerPoint? No. Hang on. Apologies. All right, here we are again. Next slide we have is okay. So here are a listing of some of the highest silica exposures that we see that the MIOSHA enforcement side has seen. Of course, they relate a lot to abrasive blasting, and any of the bridge work that you see is going to have a lot of that in it. Also, concrete cutting, tuck pointing, where buildings are renovated, rehabbed, drilling, of course, grinding, sawing, shoveling, sweeping, and chipping and jackhammering. Perhaps a little bit less of what you guys do than a lot of the things, but there are many things in the building trades where concrete is cut and shaped and formed. So those are the important things. Anything that's going to create a lot of dust, I am sure, given that you guys are willing to come to this presentation, I'm sure you've seen dust clouds, and where you see the dust clouds and where you see the dry grinding and cutting, you can see those from a great distance. Those are the things that will have the public calling on you and trying to uh, uh, get you in trouble. And it doesn't stop. I've been on the consultation side since uh, uh, October, and people are still sending me pictures and emails and texts about somebody doing the wrong thing in your area. Not because you're worried about somebody turning you in, for your own employees' sake, uh, make sure to do whatever you can to limit the employee exposures. And one of the easiest way to do that is to train the employees that work for you and provide them with information about how to limit these hazards. The training has to include information about the health hazards associated with silica exposure. And that goes back to the silicosis and the cancer and the bad things that can result from breathing in respirable crystalline silica. You have to also train them about the specific tasks in your workplace that could result in a silica exposure. And that we take that one step back, and we talked in the beginning about the exposure control plan. These written exposure control plans, when paired together with a listing of the jobs that you actually do, they will make your field foreman experts in being able to protect those employees from being exposed to respirable crystalline silica. Additionally, other specific measures that you as the employers have implemented that protect the employees from silica exposures. And those always include things like engineering controls, the hoses and the liquid, that essentially if you have a integrated water to the wheel where the cutting is happening, and if you're operating your tool according to the manufacturer's instructions, that really is the most important thing that you can do as an engineering control to limit the dust. The work practices and companies that I've talked to in the past have work practices written in the exposure control plan, and somehow between the writing of the plan and the year-long performance of the work activities, there are a lot of times there's a disconnect with that. When you have an exposure control plan that says after cutting, or these have to be cut, and then they have to be wet, and then they have to be cleaned up, the cuts to any pieces of concrete, relief cuts that you make, those things are in place, everything's great. But many times when I see employers do this, they'll skip the wetting part and they'll go directly from the cutting to a dry cleanup. When the dry cleanup happens, facilitated by a wire whip at the end of something that looked to me strangely like a weed whacker, when that happens, a lot of dust occurs. And that employer, he put together a good plan to say, cut, water, cleanup. And the only thing that was omitted was the water. And the whip was the same all the way through. It just when you have a plan and a program and you don't follow all the requirements of it, it's pretty easy as an enforcement when I did this, for me to say, well, except when the plan says they're supposed to be doing these things, but the person in the field is not actually doing what the plan says. And that's when employers look back to your field foreman to make sure your plan is put in place and is followed each and every work site. It's nobody expects, nobody can predict when they're going to see MIOSHA. And I came to a lot of sites where people were very unhappy to see me. In this site as a presenter, a trainer for the consultation division, that happens a lot less. But thankfully, you guys are there to be able to put these programs in place and then do the best thing you could possibly do, and that's to make these programs work. You pick the program off the paper, and through your field foreman, your superintendents, maybe you make that plan, protect your employee, and that way you have it exactly the way you want it. Something predictable and viewable that you can show and prove to anyone that you've protected your employee. If your employee is required to wear a respirator over 30 days, or if you're exposed at or above the action limit for 30 days, you have to put them under a medical surveillance program. And I will say, most of the employers that I know have gone to great lengths to try to minimize their employees who are put in the medical surveillance program. We don't blame anyone for trying to do that, but the most important thing is that you know, as their employer, what their actual exposures are. If you have a record of some testing, it's very easy for us to say, well, they're trying to protect their people, they're trying to understand their exposures, and usually, if the work is done in the right way, you'll be able to limit or eliminate the exposures over the action limit that your employees have. And what a medical surveillance program is made up of, it's basically gives you in-depth medical work history, respiratory dysfunction, any smoking history, and abrasive blasters in the union, people who do heavy cutting are really good at putting together in-depth historical pictures of the employee's medical work history. About 3 or 4 years ago, I had a complaint where the employee called and said he was diagnosed with silicosis, and he was trying to state that it was his recent employer's fault that he got silicosis. But then during the investigation, the more recent employer reviewed the medical records, and he saw that employee had a silicosis diagnosis, or a designated sickness, prior to coming to his business. So, it's the work histories are not always bad. They protect the employees, but they also sometimes protect the employers as well. If you find that you hire someone who has silicosis, it's important to continue to keep that employee protected, but you also know that respirable crystalline silica exposure that causes silicosis, that belongs initially to a different employer, if that's your case. To prove that, things like chest x-rays, pulmonary function tests, and of course, testing for latent tuberculosis infection. The pulmonary function tests, I want to go into those a little bit, because there's been a lot of pushback from the system to discourage employees to get pulmonary function tests. As an employee, and I'm an employee myself of MIOSHA, I try to get a pulmonary function test as often as possible. Now, COVID-19 prevented a lot of us from getting these. For me, it's been 3 years since I've had one. I'm really trying to get one now. And sometimes it's a little more difficult to get your testing that you need, but make sure that gets done to protect your employees. And especially when somebody comes on, an old timer from a different business, you understand their previous disease if they have it. And at least if you're going to employ that employee in the future, try to protect yourself and them. The crystalline Silica exposure control plan. Here's what's in it. Basically a lot of different things that you put together to protect your employees through the control plan. It says use wet cutting. These are just simple, basic methods to employ in all cases. Avoid, if you can, performing dusty work in enclosed areas. And if you do, well, of course, you're going to require a lot more ventilation. Local ventilation can take some of that dust from you. Provide training on the hazards of silica exposure. Use respiratory protection when you don't know whether your employees below the action limit. If you're abrasive blasting, you use a helmet. If your people are in respirators, another step back is to make sure that you have a written respirator program. Now, at the beginning of this presentation, you may not have already taken that down, but at the end of the presentation, I'll have my contact information again. I want you to take that down. And if nothing else, if you don't have these exposure control plans in place, and even if you do, I want you to call or email me or call me and say, hey, I need these written programs that we're talking about. For me, the most important one, I think, is the written respirator program, because what that does really, it sets the stage for the employer. Any employer who would have an employee who needs a respirator, it sets them the stage for them for properly putting a respirator on their employee. And putting a respirator on someone, no employer should think of this as a loss of not being able to keep their people away from respirators. The reality is a lot of companies who need respirators don't have a respirator program, but throw respirators at their employees anyway. That's really, to me, I think that's a dangerous thing, because these written programs can be written up and they can be reviewed and they can be put in place just like any. What that does is that makes, say, for instance, the worst thing that could happen, does happen. Your employee sick, you have a respirator program, and you're trying to protect your employee through the course of his employment. Here are when you decide to do exposure control methods. The exposure control methods are meant to show that your employee performing a certain task is under the action limit. And the couple of ways you can do that are by testing it. If it's not in OSHA Table 1, that we'll talk about briefly here in a minute, you do this performance or scheduled air monitoring. And during that performance or scheduled air monitoring, you can show that the methods you've employed are keeping your employee action limit. And in order to do that, it's pretty simple. You describe the task. If it's not covered under Table 1, you measure the task by hanging a pump on an employee. Environmental companies do that a lot. And, for guys in your business, I say this. You have to be careful, because these environmental companies are easy to use. And to be honest, if you had one of your employees doing it, you would probably have to pay that person more. So this is basically a lot of times a contracted out project that you guys can get done at the lower cost of someone else's employee. Objective data. Occasionally you'll find a product, like, for instance, here, if you have a drywaller who's using a very low silica drywall mud, and they have a material that shows predictably it's not going to expose the employees over the action limit, then you can use that data from that manufacturer to show that your employee won't be exposed if he does the methods that are prescribed within the objective data. We're going to talk first about performance and scheduled air monitoring. This is basically exactly as it's described. You do the work. A couple of ways to handle that are to schedule air monitoring at a certain period, or to do performance monitoring. You test a specific activity. Many of the inspections that I had in the enforcement division resulted in employees having a number of employers having a number of employees doing work under Table 1, but then in the vicinity of that area, there are also employees doing other work that isn't listed under Table 1. I will tell you, if you have your people who are doing operations listed under this Table 1, that's easy. It's less easy to do this performance or scheduled air monitoring, which is basically it's an operation which may be typical to you, but not covered under Table 1. We're going to cover those. I'm going to try to skim along a little faster here so we can get to them, but we're going to cover those in just a second here. Basically, the methods to control your exposures. And you'll see here an operator using a handheld saw to cut a material. Very simply, is creating a dust from that, and that is likely to be a respirable silica exposure. What you see hanging over his shoulder is a cyclone with an air pump attached to it that is collecting data for his exposure evaluation. This here, it would be absolutely necessary because obviously this guy is performing what would be a Table 1 covered operation, handheld cutting with a handheld grinder. If he decides to do it this way, conceivably an employer could show that that employee is under the action limit. Based on what I see in the photograph, he wouldn't be, but those are things that employers can try to do. But here, it just looks like an effort to measure the actual exposure this employee is getting, because as you see, the employees in the immediate work vicinity are not adequately protected in any way for that type of cutting. And the scheduled monitoring option says that they have to perform 8-hour TWA exposure monitoring for the employees based on one or more breathing zone samples. Each shift, each job classification, basically each type of work that you do out there that's covered under Table 1 would be considered each job classification. If you have several employees that do the same kind of thing, you may sample a representative fraction of those employees. If you do that representative sampling, the employer has to try to determine which of the employees would be subject to the highest exposure to respirable crystalline silica. Essentially, the frequency of that, if the initial results of your testing for a Schedule 1 operation show that it's below the action limit, no additional monitoring is necessary. If through your testing and periodic testing, you found testing that shows some of the testing is over the action limit, you need to repeat that within 6 months. If the most recent result shows you're over the PEL, you need to repeat that every 3 months. So those are 3 conditions that are very distinct. They sound a lot alike on paper, but the reality is if you have initial results that shows they're under the action limit, basically means there's no dust. It means if you have something that's your recent result over the action limit, you test that every 6 months. If you have a recent result over the PEL, that's pretty considerable. So that means if you can't get it below the action limit, you have to repeat testing every 3 months. Very important to know. And you can scale it back when you have two consecutive non-initial results taken 7 or more days apart, but not less than 6 months apart, and showing that those are above the action limit. Employee notifications, and whenever, even in this job now, when I do air testing, I recently had to go to talk to the employees to describe the results of my exposure evaluation. And so, as your employers, the employers out there will and shall basically notify employees about their exposure evaluation when those are conducted, whether it's a scheduled or performance monitoring. You have to provide those results to the employee within 15 working days after the completion of the assessment. The employer can post the results in appropriate location, accessible to all affected employees. Uh, 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 and if the exposures exceed the PEL, employers have to describe in writing the corrective action that will be taken to reduce or limit exposures to those employees. Have to allow the employees observation of a monitoring session. Basically, if you're going to conduct air monitoring, if you're lucky enough to find a contractor whose employees will probably be paid less than yours on an hourly basis, you find that contractor, you get them out there testing, and make sure that your employees can take a look at the evaluation while it's occurring. Objective data. I'm going to cover this just very briefly because we don't have a great deal of time, but objective data basically means the material or process that you're using as something that can predictably be used or done without creating an overexposure, even an exposure over the action limit. So those things, if the material is so free of silica, if the job is so free of disturbance of silica, objective data can be made by anyone if you have significant enough basis of data. Sometimes manufacturers have that. Many times they don't. So take a look out there if there's something that gives you objective data. If you can use it, more power to you. You don't have to do the testing. You just have to follow the methods described by the objective data, and you can predictably ensure that your employees won't be overexposed. All righty. Lastly, OSHA Table 1 in the rest of the RCS is part 690. Super important for you guys because it makes the situation easy. This describes all of the things that you need to put in place. And if you put those things in place, predictably, you will have an employee that's exposed below the action limit. It seems very simple to me, and employees or employers, it's very important to put in place something that shows that the employee is not going to be overexposed. Here's how to do that. Follow Table 1. The tasks. If you read Table 1 of the standard, it contains a number of different tasks in it. If you can match that up to a job that your company does, it's a good thing. People think it's a bad thing because we're doing this work, but guess what? You're doing the work anyway. The standard says what it says anyway. If you can match it up, you can at least put in your program, hey, we're going to do these things to predictably protect our employees. If you can predictably protect your employees, almost all of the employers that I know and have met over the course of these 23 years almost want to protect their employees. So let's take just the first one here, and something you guys may see every day, all day. The operation here, it's using a handheld saw of any diameter. And I think the middle one is really, it's difficult to see, but it's supposed to depict a stationary masonry saw. If those operations are taking place, the testing, these protections can protect your employee. And that would be to have a half mask with an APF of 10, a very simple filtering face piece respirator will do that work for you. And here's that example again. It's a stationary masonry saw, which is used to cut concrete block or other concrete surfaces. Very simple. The standard in table 1 gives you specific measures to put in place to ensure that if you put those in place, the employee will not be overexposed. And that looks like this. If you have a stationary masonry saw, you must, for table 1, use a saw integrated or equipped with integrated water delivery system. What that means is it means the hose is connected directly to the saw and can spray on the blade. And to operate the tool in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions. Very simple, very, very clear cut, right? If you do those things, what kind of protection do you need? Well, if you're under 4 hours a shift, you need none. If you're over 4 hours a shift, you need none. So what that means is if you want to continue to not using the integrated water, you will have to then do this scheduled or performance monitoring and show that your person's not being overexposed. This is a very simple way to do it. People don't like it because your concrete, your blocks end up wet. They don't like it, but the reality is this is the way to protect your employee. Not the easiest way, but perhaps the best. And I'm going to go over these really quickly because this is a pretty stark difference. If you'll see the video here with dust emanating, right? Lots of dust there. The next one, it's going to be, he is operating, and you can see that if you look really closely, but you cannot see dust. You cannot see, he has a vacuum control on his grinder. Okay. Silica, how it should look if you're grinding concrete. You should have a hose, you should have a shroud, you should have a vacuum, a pre-filter, separator, and a HEPA filter. Pretty simple. You can pull the very small respirable silica out of the employee's work zone with that vacuum. Again, the action limit, 25 microgram per cubic meter, is very small. When the standard first came out in 2015, people were freaking out. They would call us and they were very worried that they would never be able to get below the action limit. Well, guess what? A lot of employers have. Many, many, many employers do this and have protected their employees over the course of time. I'm going to end this presentation with a picture that shows basically how much silica, if you were to put it directly into the air, how much silica would be required to make a space that is over the permissible exposure limit. And here is that. This is basically 1,000 grams of silica put into the air in a space. Once that's in the air, you can't see it really. This employee is standing in basically this is one of my coworkers who put together a specific size space, got a photograph of 1,000 grams of silica and showed how much, what it would look like if you put that silica in the air, and that employee there would be facing 50 microgram per cubic meter. Very, very stark to say wow, that's a really small bit of silica getting thrown into the air and creating a dangerous condition. We know that when you can see that, you can understand the potential of what it would be like to have a giant grinder kicking in these terrible dust clouds. You guys in your business, and especially the ones who care about this, can make sure to protect the employees working around them and make sure they're not overexposed to this respirable crystalline silica, something that's very important. And when you realize that the people who are dying from this disease, they're, upper 50s, 60s, construction workers who've been working all their lives. Some of them have big, beautiful trucks and nice houses and wives and children that love them to death. But they are men and women get this disease and people can die from it. So it's very important that we get it out to you guys and you help us all to protect the people in your industry. Here are some of the resources that were used in this presentation. If you need additional help, I will be happy to provide information and communication. If you need something like, say, for instance, evaluation of your work site through, say, a hazard survey, we can do that. In my former life, I was the friend to citations. If citations were there, I didn't have a problem introducing my citations to people who deserve to meet them. Now, in this business, I'm a consultant. So I provide training, education, and information to people in your business. And if you want a hazard survey done, you can contact me. And if you're on the west side of the state, cover the same area as me, I will schedule that and conduct it myself. If you're working in other areas of state, of course, I might put you in touch to some of my colleagues and you can get help through them. One way or another, if you give me a call or if you send me an email, I'll be happy to help. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. We appreciate you taking the time today to talk to us about this. If you have any other questions, if you run into something, he's a great resource. And I'm sure, Keith, you're willing to answer any questions anyone has. They want to follow up with you at a later time. But thank you again for presenting. For those of you who are online, he covered a lot of information. This will be available on the Michigan Concrete Association website. It is miconcrete.org/webinars. This will be available by the end of the week up there as a resource to you. So with that, Keith, thank you again for being a part of this, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you. I'm happy to help. I hope you guys have a nice day as well.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.